I'm Fred Schueler, and I'm living in Bishop Mills, Ontario since 1978 with my wife Alita Karstad, and I'm going to be talking about some of the things that we do on our land to study what's going on and to try to promote a more biodiverse kind of habitat. And this is a 19th century settlement on the Smiths Falls limestone plain where we have very shallow soil over limestone, and in a history before there was a lot of burning of oil to heat houses, of really extensive deforestation and heavy grazing of the land, so that people were just sort of getting by doing things that we would call degrading the ecosystems. And so we're trying to promote restoration of ecosystems and a biodiverse kind of place to live in. We record when the chickadees give their Phoebe song, because when Alita did Wild Seasons Daybook, she boldly said that they start to do the Phoebe song at the winter solstice. And now this year I'm getting into figuring out how late they do it, and when they stop, because it's confirmed that they really do start it about the winter solstice most years. This is the dreadful and dangerous poison parsnip, which herbicide companies urge municipalities to buy lots of herbicide to spray along the roadsides, and it can cause very painful blisters because it has a substance in the sap of its leaves that cause large blisters to form on your skin if you're exposed to sun before you wash it off. But that poison is a deterrent for its main predator, and that's the parsnip webworm, which is a moth that eats the seeds. This is the plant that has most heavily used by the webworms this year, and you can see places where the caterpillars, after they've eaten the seeds, have crawled down and cut holes in the stems, and they go into the stems to pupate, and they're probably emerging as moths now. And the thing is that parsnips were introduced to North America as vegetables, but they only brought the seeds over. They didn't bring the webworms, and so for 250 years they lived without their main pest, and the level of the toxins went down to very low levels. And then in 1869 the webworms were found in Ontario, and they gradually spread, and this has been tracked in herbarium specimens that the level of the toxins increased through the 20th century, and they're now at European levels of the toxicity. And this is just the time when everybody had protested against spraying roadsides with herbicides, and the herbicide companies were sort of shuddering, and then they found out about poison parsnips and encouraged the use of their products to spray. And they're not sprayed particularly accurately, so they missed the parsnips, but they hit the milkweed. This here is a plant just nearby that had many fewer webworms, and you can see that it set a whole lot of seed. And this year, 2022, we saw very few webworms in any of the stands along roadsides, and we're sort of trying to manage the study of parsnips so they can be managed to have more webworms, because their biocontrol insect is already here. We just have to manage to promote the pest that reduces the population of the parsnips. In outback on our land, we have a place where A couple of years ago, we had really heavy webworms, and there's many fewer parsnips now than there was then. Bed of chopped Japanese knotweed that we ground up with the lawnmower and put here because we'd heard that sometimes the Japanese knotweed will sprout from cut up pieces of stem, and we did this rather late in the year, so it's probably not a good test of that, but we're just seeing whether they survive the winter and sprout in the spring. This is sort of a lateral shoot of an English walnut. We planted here. We were down at Lake Erie, and there was a family that had English walnuts, and they gave us a whole bag full of nuts, and we planted some of them, and we've sort of confirmed what other nut growers have found in eastern Ontario is that these English walnuts don't make trees here, but they do survive, and this is a lateral shoot off of one that's gotten about 2 meters and a bit high, but every year that it's below -30, everything above the snow gets frozen and killed, but the plants survive. This is a pond that we're making in a hole we dug years and years ago with a liner from repairs to our daughter's swimming pool in Kemptville, and we're going to keep it full of water and put chorus frog tadpoles in it to see how the chorus frogs survive, and what else grows in an isolated pond with no fish that's kept full of water from the hose. And we have a couple of species of liverworts that we've introduced here to see how they overwinter, that we got from the Evergreen Center down near Westport this spring when we were there. And you can see there's a track of one Physa snail we put in that we don't know if it's going to make it through the winter. We don't know how. The water's going to be a little bit deeper. We'll put some more water in and raise the berm a little bit so it'll be a bit deeper than this. But the idea is to cover the whole bottom with flat rocks. This here is giant ragweed, which we've planted here because we've observed that there are places where it lives underneath black walnuts, which secrete something that poisons the soil for a lot of plants, and these are sort of a byproduct of studying that. And this is what's called poke or pokeweed, which is a plant that used to be eaten in the spring. The shoots eaten like asparagus until it was shown that they cause cancer, and people don't eat them. But it's one of these native North Americans that's been restricted by cold winters and is able to move north, and we've sort of helped these move north by getting the seeds in Niagara Falls. But we've had winters when all the plants have been killed off, when it was too cold for them. And then this plant is one that we actually had in a potted plant indoors, but they've also, if you turn around and look here, they've also germinated from seeds that birds had just carried around the place. And last year we had the Harmonia Asian ladybird beetles clustering on the berries and squeezing the juice out of them. This thicket is what we call the Negundo Grove because it's got Manitoba maples, Acer negundo, and it's growing up with Canada plum. The yellower leaved things are Canada plum, and the ones that are still green are European buckthorn or cathartic buckthorn, which is an invasive alien. And we had, back in the 80s, we had this idea of that every parcel of land should pay the wild tithe and have 1/10 of its area completely untouched by management or anything, and this was the wild tithe for the lot associated with one of our houses. But there were so many invasive aliens that we gave up on that and started to cut the invasive aliens down. This was the garbage pile or midden from the houses back in the day before there was municipal waste collection. We're looking at getting sugar maples. There's woods across the street that are downwind from the big sugar maples, but this is upwind from the big sugar maples, and just no sugar maple seedlings here at all. So we've planted a few. Ravens and crows both calling. We didn't have ravens in Grenville County until 1992, and now they're really pretty common. Stop shooting at things and they'll stop being scared of you. There's an awful lot of big birds, and I mean, we first observed it with woodchucks in Toronto, that they weren't afraid of us. But we don't have very many woodchucks now because the Ministry of Natural Resources controlled fox rabies, and we have a lot more foxes and they eat the woodchucks. So the woodchucks are nowhere near as abundant as they used to be. But the ravens and the great blue herons, and we have turkeys, which are said to have been lured across this. You know, turkeys were introduced in a lot of Ontario and Quebec by the time they got to the border because of the introductions in New York State. But the story is told that the Ministry of Natural Resources lured our eastern Ontario turkeys across the river from New York State by playing turkey calls on the Ontario shore of the St. Lawrence. And they came, and they were very skittish until the ice storm. And then the ice storm in 1998, they discovered bird feeders, and they're no longer afraid of people because people don't shoot at them. There was a chickadee there. This is a rock elm that we planted in 2013. Our friend Owen Clarkin, he and Justin Peters are just keen on bringing back rock elms, which don't have the same massive seed production that American elms do, and so they haven't recovered from having been favored as a tree that had rock hard wood, and because they have sort of these fleshy, very tasty fruits that don't disperse as well as the other elms do. But this is a native species. It's more resistant to Dutch elm disease than the American elm is. And this has grown up this big, it flowered this year for the first time. This is a leopard frog, which was my thesis species. I did geographic variation in leopard frogs all across Canada and the northeastern states. And since the winter of 2013-2014, we've had very, very few of them. They always used to be the most abundant species of frog around here. And this year they've come back. And so you can just see something jumping in among the daylilies, and it's a frog. So this is a bur oak, and this is one we planted that we got the seedling from Owen, but we have had these little bur oaks cropping up very occasionally when blue jays carry the seeds for however many hundreds of meters it is that we are from the nearest mature bur oak. And this is growing up through a Manitoba maple, where we cut down one of the stems in 1990, and we're going to have to trim this branch off so the oak can get up through it. One of the things somebody ought to do is to quantitatively study the shape of bur oak leaves, because they're just so incredibly variable. This tree has been nipped off by deer on some winters before it really got started to be tall enough. So these these bushes I'm standing among are Canada plum, which is a species that lives in brushy old fields like this, but it's afflicted by what's called the plum pockets disease. And most years, all the flowers are infected by a fungus that, instead of making a plum, blows the flower up into a sort of green balloon that produces fungus spores all over its surface. And you can see the remnants of some of these here. This year we were very fortunate, and with sort of kinky spring weather, a lot of the plums actually matured as plums and we were able to harvest them. But this is a species that spreads by suckering, and this thicket was only a few bushes when we moved here, and they spread by suckering up from the underground roots. And if it could reproduce by seeds, it would probably take the place of the cathartic buckthorn that's spreading in so much of the old fields in eastern Ontario. But it only spreads very poorly because the individual bushes spread fine, but the species doesn't get back to new habitats because the seeds are so infrequently produced. And this is a big thing in eastern Ontario. The whole landscape was deforested in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and there's lots and lots of species that need to be reintroduced into the secondary forests and the regrown wetlands, where even the sugar bushes, where you have mature trees, they were grazed in the summer, and so a lot of the forest floor wildflowers were just grazed out of the sugar bushes, and it looks like a forest, but it's just trees. And here we have a cover object that we haven't looked at in a few years. It's got the queens and the males getting ready to do their dispersal, and also a pile of eggs there. We had a lad we were corresponding with about remote aquatic hibernacula, and he said that on our premises there's a master's thesis under every board. These are lilacs, and one traditionally thinks of lilacs as persisting as an individual clump where there was a home site, and not spreading. But when we did the Place to Walk book in 1994, we found just huge areas along Lake Ontario that were just purple with lilac in the spring. And then our neighbors, and we have lilacs by our outhouse that haven't shown any signs of spreading seeds around into the lawns and gardens around them. But when our neighbors planted lilacs along their house, this was close enough to this shallow soil limestone old field that they've just come out and just swarmed the place. And we've done a certain amount of whacking down and using them for firewood, but they sprout incredibly vigorously. This is one of the sepia snails that we introduced to study the change in the frequency of the banding patterns on the shells. This is a sapling of an invasive alien, Scots pine. Scots pine, when reforestation started in eastern Ontario, was a very popular species to plant because it wasn't vulnerable to the weevils that take the leaders out of white pine, and forestry was imported. The way forestry was done was imported from Europe, and this was a species that European foresters were acquainted with. this this tree last year, there were pine sawfly larvae, which are like caterpillars that eat needles, um, on all of these trees around here, and they ate all the old needles. So these needles are last year's needles and this year's needles, but no older ones, because they were just stripped naked by the sawflies, and we haven't seen any sawflies at all this year. So this is the largest of these Scots pine seedlings that have blown in here. The neighbors had a Scots pine tree where this is where the seeds came from, but it was killed in 2012. There's a nematode that is a pine blight, and it's a native North American, seems to affect the European Scots pine more than it does the native species, and it took out quite a few of the Scots pine. So this is what we call the nutrient depletion glade, which is an open place among all the cedars where we try to maintain the low nutrient status that the land had when we moved here in 1978. What happened through the 19th, early 20th centuries, basically, is that cattle were let loose to graze everywhere, and they ate all the forage, and then they went into the barn and defecated in the barn and made manure that was then spread on the gardens to grow vegetables. And so the whole countryside was stripped of its nutrients. And we sort of began to realize this here with this clump of carex here, where we found a roadkill cat, and we buried the roadkill cat here, and this green stuff grew up and made I'm not sure which of these three patches it was, but it was one of them, just because the cat provided nutrients. And since then, well, not since then, but the past decade or so, we've been managing this to remove nutrients. So you can see all the golden brown branches on the cedar trees around, and we rake them up in the fall and carry them into just like the cattle did with their manure, carry them in to mulch the rhubarb, and to keep the ground here depleted of nutrients. And because there's a lot of species that depend on low nutrient status, they have adaptations to low nutrient status, and a lot of the native plants are dependent on that, and the open conditions provide habitat for tiger beetles and various other things. And so this is our memorial to the way things were. So this is a fringed gentian, which is a spectacular wildflower species that only comes out and shows up every few years. The last time we had them was 2011, so it's been 11 years. And some years they're there, and some years they aren't. And we had a neighbor down the road who had the first ones they'd ever seen on their land, and then we came out and checked, and sure enough, here they were on ours. So this is the Nova Succinia board, which we call after Nova Succinia, which is our native succiniid snail, and which we haven't seen here for many years. But we have here the sepia, introduced sepia. These are mature ones in two color phases, the 5-banded and the mid-banded. And you can see the dark line along the lip of the shell, which means it's this species rather than its sister species, which is also found in eastern Canada, although not right here.
Why do you pay attention to things in your own yard instead of exotic and fancy places?
Well, it's sort of a theory. It's a fractal theory of natural history that the closer you look anywhere as you can find interesting stuff. And part of our principles is that we don't go into parks and reserves um, just because to minimize trampling unless somebody asks us to do some research there. But there's always, anywhere as you look, there's stuff to study. And there's the, what's his name, quote, you know, cities are fascinating places to study, but not for me to live in. Um, so we have a lot of places in various cities where we keep track of things as well. This is an ash tree, a green ash that, a young lad who was sort of a scoundrel in his youth and has grown up to be a stalwart businessman in the one business in the community, cut down in 1981, and then these two trunks sprouted up from the stump, and were going along being pretty good trees until the emerald ash borer came along. And when the emerald ash borer sort of kills off the vascular structure of the tree, you get all these sprouts, what are called epicormic sprouts, that come out from the trunk as the tree's in the process of dying or dying back. And so one of the projects for this fall is to cut down the dying ash trees and just leave a couple of the most vigorous sprouts from each tree, in the hope that when the biocontrol insects get here and control the emerald ash borer, that the trees will be able to grow back. And we know this one's already grown back once from having been cut down, and so we can hope that it'll do it again. This is purple loosestrife, which used to be the poster child of invasive alien plants until Vern Blossy brought a biocontrol beetle over from Europe, and Naomi Cappuccino brought them into eastern Ontario, and the beetles just chew back the plants. In 2005, the whole landscape that had been just solid purple loosestrife was just gray with the dead plants. Here's some purple loosestrife that has a fair amount of holes from the biocontrol beetles in the leaves, and in a very forked growth because they eat the growing tips. But in the spring, they're really rolled back. Of course, they were replaced by bird's foot trefoil, which is another introduced species, but that's the way things go. So these are the other invasive buckthorn, Frangula alnus or Rhamnus frangula, which grows up in more open areas, or less open areas than the cathartic buckthorn does, but it also has toxins in its leaves and poisons, and you can see that the leaves are all intact, that nothing eats it. And I tried to engage people with funding to sort of take the native buckthorn, which is a species at risk, into greenhouses and see what eats on that, and then try to get these insects switched over to the invasive buckthorns, but nobody has done that yet. If the native ones are so rare, there must be something that's keeping them back, and it should be able to switch them over to other species in the same genus. So this is what we call the Pentecostal culvert, because it's the culvert that comes across from the land of the Pentecostal church. And this is a hole that I just dug this year. This is a place where frogs hibernate when this all fills up with water in the winter. And we the past few years we've had people running snowmobiles up across the traditional hole for hibernation. So I've dug another one. And we think that we have so many frogs hibernating in little out-of-the-way places because the creek becomes anoxic in the winter and it's not a safe place to necessarily a safe place to hibernate it. And so they try to hibernate and sometimes succeed in these little roadside holes.